Welcome to the McCarthy Report, the podcast where I, Rich Lowry, discuss with Andy McCarthy the latest legal and national security issues. This week, what else? The Matt Gaetz case and the latest on the Mar-a-Lago special master. You are, of course, listening to a Nashville podcast. If for some reason you're not already following us on streaming service, you can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes. So please give this podcast and Andy McCarthy the glowing, indeed gushing, 5-star reviews they deserve on iTunes. And now, without further ado, I welcome to this very podcast through the miracle of Zoom, none other than Andy McCarthy.
Rich, how are you?
Good, Andy. I'm disappointed we're not doing this podcast in person. We are both in the same area here, Simi Valley, preparing for the Buckley Prize event tonight, honoring Larry Kudlow, and we thought that we were in the same hotel. I actually came up to what I thought was your room in my slightly fancier hotel than yours, Andy, but it turns out you're across town, across the tracks, and another much less desirable property. So we had to do this, as usual, via Zoom.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping, Rich, that when I get older, you guys will let me at the adult table. But, for now, I'm gonna struggle by in the sunshine. It's really hot here.
It is.
It's hotter than I expected, especially I was in Chicago for a few days. So it kind of turned autumn there. And then I stepped off the plane here and man, it was hot and steamy summer all over again. But I did find a place to cool off, Rich. And
they have those in your hotel?
Yeah. And while making sure to maintain my fluids, I was able to catch your guy, Aaron Judge, hit the historic home run. So that was, you must be walking on air over that. That was neat.
Yeah. And of course I missed it. I was in a long meeting, and I follow, wherever I am, I've followed every single at bat. During this meeting, I caught almost every at bat on my ESPN app. And the person running this meeting was giving concluding remarks. I was like, Judge is about to be up, but it's, I should just, out of politeness, make sure I'm just totally listening to what's being said here at the end of this, 3-hour marathon meeting. And sure enough, I look at my phone and the home run's been hit. But what an accomplishment. And it just brings home how hard it is, getting from 60 to 61. So much psychological pressure to do that. If he had missed, he's been healthy all year and almost played every game. If he'd missed a week, he might not be where he is. So it just goes to how rare this is. Only 3 people have gotten up in this atmosphere without cheating between 1998 and 2001. So hats off to him. And I imagine even as a Mets fan, you have to appreciate the achievement.
I more than appreciate it. I think that the real amazing accomplishment is if you put aside all of the steroids stuff, he does it without an asterisk, which, with Maris, it was always, was he going to be able to do it in 154 games, which he wasn't. Ruth hit 60 in 154 before they had a bunny rabbit in the baseball. And Maris was always dogged by the fact that he took 100 and, he had to play the full modern season of 162. So does Judge, but he hit it. We're at 151 last night. They have about 10 games to go or thereabouts. But
no, I think it might be a game 155. I'm not sure.
Well, in any event, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought he got it inside the along the lines of the old season. But in any event, it's just it's a remarkable accomplishment, and they're nuts. If they let him go, I mean, they should. Whatever it takes to keep him, they got to keep him. Yeah.
Anyway, despite what we might think, listeners do not come to this podcast for our baseball commentary. So let's get into the legal analysis. So we've had this Matt Gaetz case blow up. A lot of commentary, including on the editor's podcast that and including from Brett Stevens at the New York Times. This just shows. Once again, we have a politicized FBI. Why was this such focus? Why do we hear so much about it? Does this have to do with the fact that he's a bomb-throwing right winger who's very, very inconvenient and undesirable to the powers that be? What's your take on this case?
Well, I think what this is, Rich, is a case of the straw that broke the camel's back, but it's a misfire. And the FBI, to be fair, has no one to blame but the FBI for the predicament that it's in. You know, Charlie wrote a column, I think it was yesterday, laying out in chapter and verse the sorry history of the FBI. I wrote one a couple of weeks ago on the same issue, pointing out that, the FBI, for all of its pretensions about, playing it by the straight and narrow, is still headquartered in the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington. They've never divorced themselves from that legacy.
Andy, sorry to interrupt. This is the most important point, but why don't they change? I'm not a big canceller or name changer, but why don't they change the name of that building?
I really think, Rich, that I get, and maybe this is because I worked with the Bureau for so long. Their take on Hoover is not. I mean, I'm sure if you ask them in a setting where they would now feel like it was necessary to be politically correct, they would distance themselves from Hoover. But that would be a recent development. The FBI, if you deal with FBI people, they don't look at J. Edgar Hoover as a loathsome figure. In their minds, he's the formative figure of the FBI. And I have to, just to give a little inside baseball to people, because I think I've been up close and personal to this in a way that a lot of people commenting on it haven't. There's never been an agency in the history of the United States that was as self-conscious about its image as the FBI. Mm-hmm. Almost from the day that they begin training new agents, it's drummed into them that the reputation of the FBI is, like, above all else, the thing that has to be maintained. And a lot of that is bundled up with being honorable and doing things the honorable way and all that stuff. But there's a real aspect of it that has to do with the Bureau's legacy and its history. And they are not going to make a concession that they were born with original sin and that it's never been expiated. It's just not, that's not in their makeup. Now, this is a different time, and I have argued, and I don't want to fall in love too much with my own theory, because I do think, Charlie's made a very eloquent case. I've heard it made by MBD. I haven't seen him write it, but I've heard him make it on your podcast at least once, very eloquently, as he always is. There's a case for scrapping the Bureau root and branch. I'm not persuaded by it, because I think at this point in history, you have to have a principal federal law enforcement agency. You just have to have one, because federal law enforcement is just much more extensive and pervasive in some ways that are unavoidable now than it was when the FBI was formed at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's not like you by getting rid of the FBI, you would get rid of federal law enforcement. You would have to replace it. And what you would replace it with would largely be the FBI. I mean, these would be be the same trained people. So I think it's more important. It's vital to change the way business is done. I don't see the point of changing the sign on the door. That doesn't make sense to me. But I'm not saying that there's not a worthy case for it. I just don't see. I just think it'd be a lot of wasted effort. But I do agree with Charlie and with Brett and with other people who say that you need to have. I don't like the church committee because I think it did a lot of harm as well as good. But it was absolutely essential to have congressional inquiries into the intelligence community at that time. And I do think it's necessary to have congressional inquiries into the performance of the FBI. The last decade has been a disaster. It wasn't that great before that. And I have argued, to repeat what I said in the column I alluded to, that I think what happened, the main problem with the FBI, if you want to take a step beyond whether they've ever gotten over the Hoover legacy, which I concede is a big problem, And that is basically the case for starting all over again. But I think if you accept, as I do, that the FBI evolved past Hoover largely after he left, and that it was a pretty good, not perfect by any means, and you'll never get a perfect one, but it was a pretty good law enforcement agency. But I believe beginning in the early to mid 1990s, after the World Trade Center bombing, but this picked up steam in the years that immediately followed this, the Bureau became an intelligence agency first and foremost, rather than a law enforcement agency. And I just think that the ethos of an intelligence agency is not only different from a law enforcement agency, it's almost, you'd almost have to say it's antithetical. And I realized this in a way I never had before when, during the Blind Sheikh case, I had to get a briefing from the CIA about what happened in Afghanistan, what the American role was, what we did to help the Mujahideen, who got the funding, how we did it. They didn't want to tell me anything. They didn't want to tell me a word. And unlike the FBI, when the FBI didn't want to tell me things, I had ways of figuring out what they didn't want to tell me. But also, there was always a pattern to...
Sorry, Andy, do you mean unlike the CIA?
Yes. Like when you have a case that's a troubled case and the FBI doesn't want to tell you details, you can tell that by some of the answers you get and the way they conduct themselves, that they're holding back on stuff they should tell you. And as the prosecutor, you've got ways to get to the bottom of it. And they were sheepish about the fact that they hold back details when they're embarrassed about something, as we all are when we do things that are worthy of being embarrassed about. The CIA, by contrast, was proudly defiant when they told me to go screw myself about having to know what happened in Afghanistan. And I was like, you don't understand. I'm the biggest, baddest prosecutor in America with the biggest, baddest case in America. You got to tell me. And they said, tell your story walking, boy. We don't have to tell you anything. Mm-hmm. And they were very happy to not have to tell me anything. In the end, they gave me the bare minimum of what I needed in order to comply with my discovery obligations in the trial. But their attitude about it was, we tell you, you tell the bad guys. We're not interested in your stupid case. We're here to protect the United States from people who want to kill us. You're a prosecutor for now, maybe for 3 years, then you go become a defense lawyer. And, you take all the things you learn from the government and you use it against us. Screw you. I mean, that was basically their attitude toward me. So it's a very different ethos. When you become an intelligence agency, the priority is secrecy. And in the FBI, the priority has to be civil rights. It has to be due process. It has to be the Constitution. The CIA, in a lot of places that the CIA does its most important work for the United States, it's against the law. If they get caught doing it, people get killed for engaging in espionage. Whereas the FBI, no matter how important its investigations are, we want it to be strictly regulated by the Constitution. The oath it takes is to uphold the Constitution. And it only operates in places where it operates under American law. Even where it goes overseas, it's under the auspices of American law. Tightly controlled that way. And the reason that the FBI is our domestic security service rather than the CIA is that the CIA operating overseas has to do a lot of things that may violate American law, but that certainly violate the law of the places that they're in. Whereas we want everything that's done in the way of domestic law enforcement in the United States to be lawful. And that's why even when the FBI does things like undercover operations where they authorize people to commit crimes, that's got to be approved up the line, down the line, and there's various standards that apply to it and legal rules that apply to it and all that stuff. So it's a very different ethos to be a law enforcement agency versus an intelligence agency. But I think in the Clinton years, Clinton was very wedded to the idea that international terrorism was a criminal justice issue more than it was a national security issue, and that it could be combated by alliances of nations that would use law enforcement processes and prosecute terrorists in court. That was what the idea was, to try to take something that was actually a war problem, or at least a national security challenge, and apply criminal justice protocols to it. And during those years, Clinton pushed the FBI out front so that it became the lead American agency, even in places overseas where the CIA had always had pride of place. And that was because they were trying to create a new post-Cold War world where, war was over and we were now going to just do everything as if it was a law enforcement problem. And they were very committed to that. But the problem is, you can't do national security like you do law enforcement. It requires secrecy. It requires being able to operate outside the United States. It requires a whole lot of things the FBI can't do. And as I've pointed out a number of times, in the 8 years between the World Trade Center bombing of 1993 and when the World Trade Center was destroyed on 9/11, we prosecuted in 8 years exactly 29 terrorists. And most of them were connected to the 93 bombing. Osama bin Laden, when he was killed by our forces, was under indictment. That was in 2011, right? So he was under indictment by the United States Department of Justice for, since 1997, I think, at that point. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, under indictment for 20 years, captured by the military. Ayman Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden's successor, killed by the military after being under indictment by the Justice Department for about a quarter of a century. I mean, if you look at just the hard numbers and what happened, these guys were neutralized, as the euphemism goes, by military force and intelligence processes, not by law enforcement. Mm-hmm. So, it's not good for national security to try to pretend that a national security challenge is a law enforcement problem. And I think it's been very bad for the Bureau to try to take them from something they were really good at, which is criminal investigation, and make them principally an intelligence agency, which inevitably means that a lot of the due process protections that you're very conscious of every minute you're doing law enforcement, it's very easy to rationalize setting them to the side once you decide you're an intelligence agency and your job is to protect the United States. You're less interested in the niceties of due process.
So let's get to the specifics of Gaetz then. So I didn't follow this one hugely, very, very closely, so I'm a little fuzzy on it. So I'll throw out my understanding and correct it as appropriate. So there's this sleazeball that Gaetz is friendly with, who's guilty of various fraud schemes and abusing young women or trafficking young women, something of that nature. Pleads guilty and says, "Hey, Gaetz was involved as well." So we get this guilty plea. People start talking about it, and it's investigated. And the conclusion is, well, this sleazeball guy is not going to be credible to people. The young woman involved, for whatever reason, is also not going to be credible. So we're not going to be able to make a case here.
Yeah, I think the deeper background on it, Rich, is that's all true. The dirtbag's name is Greenberg, Joel Greenberg. Yeah. But a couple of important things to note here. One is, Gaetz notoriously is a out and out flamboyant pro-Trumper, right? I mean, his persona is that he's attached the hip to Trump, and he's like Trump Jr., right? He wants to be the successor. The reason I think that's an important fact is the narrative right now is they went after Gaetz because of his political prominence, so that it lines up with these other things that the FBI did. This case, this probe, was opened up under the Trump Justice Department. It was well known to Attorney General Barr. Barr, in fact, ditched a congressional briefing that he was supposed to show up for at the last minute, reportedly, on one occasion, because Gaetz was going to be there, and he didn't want to be publicly seen with Gaetz because he knew that Gaetz was under investigation. He knew what Gaetz was under investigation for. The Gaetz, by the time the thing became public, which happened in March of 2021, the investigation had been going on for almost a year. There had been no news about it. It hadn't leaked. Nothing had broken. And when it finally did leak out, tellingly, I thought, the New York Times coverage that broke the story did not attribute the information that it was given. It attributed to persons who had been briefed. It didn't say that it came from law enforcement officials. It came at a time when the FBI wouldn't have had an incentive to leak anything because they were still conducting the investigation. And it seems clear to me, at a point in time when Greenberg was conducting plea negotiations with the government, and his lawyer was starting to put out information about Gaetz, because Greenberg was looking at 12 years in prison under the sentencing guidelines. His only way out from under that was to cooperate and provide the government with what they call under the guidelines substantial assistance in the investigation of another person. So what he was trying to do was hand up Gaetz to save himself. And the case really didn't become public until there appears to be his camp putting out information, Gaetz himself responding to the information, including going on Tucker Carlson's program on Fox. And then in May, you get Greenberg pleading guilty publicly. So, to the extent that people have said the FBI put out this information, there's not a shred of evidence that I have found of the FBI putting out any information. And the information that got put out was not an anonymous, secondhand, innuendo-filled leak. A guy went into court and publicly, under oath, pled guilty to a crime that he implicated Gaetz in. And the FBI and the Justice Department, first of all, the FBI doesn't write the charges. The FBI doesn't decide who to give the plea deal to. It was the Justice Department that dropped 27 fraud counts against Greenberg, but got him to plead guilty to the sex trafficking offense. Gaetz is not the only other person who was implicated in it. But when you look at what the Justice Department put out in conjunction with the FBI, the press release that went out with the guilty plea, Gaetz' name is not mentioned. No one else's name is mentioned other than Greenberg. But if you were a well-informed person, even if you hadn't had this weeks of stuff that went on in the media before this, if you were a well-informed person and you knew Gaetz' relationship with Greenberg, and you knew that Greenberg came in and pled guilty to a sex trafficking offense in which he got a cooperation agreement and he was cooperating against other people that he said were implicated in it, it was going to be a natural thing that people in the media were going to speculate that Gaetz was implicated, which by that point, they didn't have to speculate because Gaetz was publicly saying he was under investigation. So I don't really see what the FBI did wrong on this. And to the contrary, the way I read what happened here, they conducted an investigation, and whatever noise was going on outside, they went about their work. The FBI developed information that led the prosecutors to believe that the main witnesses against Gaetz would not be credible and that they wouldn't be able to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. In the interim, the FBI makes a case on people who were trying to squeeze Gaetz and his family into paying $25 million on this nutty idea that they'll be able to get Biden to pardon them. I mean, it was an inane scheme, but a guy by the name of Stephen Alford basically said that if Dan Gaetz, who was Matt Gaetz's
to get Trump to pardon him.
No, to get Biden to pardon him.
To get Biden to pardon him?
Yes, this all happened.
Okay, all right. Okay.
This is how preposterous this is. I wish I had misspoke. But on this one, I'm actually
like, Andy, crazy Trump pardon, that would never happen.
No. I mean, Biden might, God, for all I know, Biden will pardon Hoffa. He doesn't know who's dead and who's alive from what I read in the papers. But no, the idea was this guy wanted to convince Dan Gaetz, who was a notorious politician. I shouldn't say notorious. He's a very well-known, well-to-do politician. I think the head of the Republican Senate for a number of years in Florida. So he's a very well-known guy and a very successful businessman, lawyer, I think. But anyway, so the idea was this guy, Alford, beseeched Dan Gaetz to pay $25 million that was going to be used in the search for this former FBI agent and believed to be CIA operative named Levinson, who was held in Iran and who actually is presumed dead. These guys were trying to convince him that Levinson was actually alive. So the idea was this was going to be a kind of a off-the-books effort to rescue Levinson. And then once Levinson was rescued, Matt Gaetz would be associated with the rescue, and he would become so popular that Biden would see the sense in pardoning him. That was the loony theory. So the FBI, when this happened to Gaetz, when he was beseeched this way, they reported it to the FBI. And Dan Gaetz and I believe Matt Gaetz cooperated with the FBI in their investigation of this guy, Alford, which ended up leading to Alford pleading guilty and getting a 5+ year sentence for fraud. So, I mean, I just think that if there was any evidence that the FBI was actually out there out of whole cloth trying to make up a case on Gaetz and tar him in the court of public opinion, the last thing him and his father would have done was cooperate with the FBI in this investigation, including reporting it to them. But they did, and the FBI did the investigation, and they ended up getting a conviction out of it. So how else do we know about Gaetz? We know about Gaetz because the January 6th committee went public with evidence that Gaetz had sought a pardon from Trump, which he wanted to include his exposure in the sex trafficking case. That was the idea behind that, Rich, was a pardon by Trump. And this all happened before anything got publicly reported. So it's not like the FBI put anything out about this. The January 6th committee did that. And the other thing we know about Gaetz is he confided in people who were close to him that he was thinking of giving up his seat in Congress and not seeking re-election and going to work at Newsmax. And the timing of that makes it obvious that he was concerned about this investigation and the outcome of it. Now, it doesn't mean we don't necessarily know that Axios' story about that is true. We certainly don't know what Gaetz said to who and who he said it to and all that jazz. But that reporting is, the natural inference from that reporting is that he knew he had something to worry about in connection with this investigation, not that it was a bunch of made up stuff. So I don't want to beat a dead horse, but there's a lot to say about the FBI, and there's a lot of good reason that it needs to be reformed. But I don't see this case as being it. I mean, we may find out that the FBI did some wrong things in this investigation. Looking back on it, I had a lot of investigations that I did a lot of wrong things in too. It's a very imperfect process, but there's definitely a case to be made for overhauling the FBI. This is not the catalyst for it.
So let's hit a few other things. You have the special master drama still going on in the Mar-a-Lago case, and this is not unspooling in a favorable way for former President Trump.
Yeah, I think this is really, I think, in his heart of hearts, I'm sure Trump is sorry that he went down this road. I know they thought they had won a big victory at the beginning when they got this judge, Elaine Cannon, down in Florida to rule their way and give them a special master. I think they're now going to be sorry they got a special master. And interestingly, Rich, because we were just discussing FBI and the problems at the FBI, the Trump people convinced themselves that Ray Deary would be a favorable judge for them because he signed one of the Carter Page surveillance warrants when he was a judge on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So that, for some reason, they derive from that, well, he'll be suspicious of the FBI just like we are because he knows he got duped into signing one of those warrants to his embarrassment. And I think a more sensible inference to be drawn from that is Judge Deary, who was the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York for a number of years before he was put on the court, and has always been known as a pretty hardcore law and order guy, was put on the FISA court by Chief Justice Roberts because he had a reputation for being very serious about national security matters. And he had to live under the same restrictions on classified information that Trump flouted in this investigation. He does not strike me as an ideal person for Trump to bring in to be, to voluntarily or to recommend to come in and handle this task. And of course, he hasn't been. He's basically, he would have ruled, I think, in the government's favor on the classified information, the 100 classified documents. He would have ruled that Trump didn't have any privilege claims over those if the 11th Circuit hadn't taken that out of his hands last week and dinged Judge Cannon on that. So those documents are out of the case. So what Deary has in front of him is the 11,000 plus other documents. And what he has done in order to try to comply with Judge Cannon's schedule, she wants this done by November 30th, is he very quickly had a get organized conference with Trump's lawyers and the government lawyers. And he basically said, in order to corral the things that I have to rule on privilege about, we have to make sure we know what we're dealing with. So are you ready to certify that everything that's in the FBI's, the inventory from the search that the Justice Department has now supplemented and given to Trump, will you concede that everything in there is the stuff that was seized from Mar-a-Lago? Trump, of course, doesn't want to admit that stuff was seized from Mar-a-Lago because some of it was seized from his office and it was classified documents. So he doesn't want to give them that concession. Plus, he's holding out this ridiculous argument that the FBI might have planted evidence on him. So it doesn't help him with that claim to certify that what's in this inventory is true. Judge Deary is also asking Trump's lawyers to provide any evidence they have that the FBI planted documents or planted evidence against Trump in connection with Mar-a-Lago. And they want him to provide any evidence that he has that he actually declassified anything. So Trump doesn't want to do any of this. But as we've discussed, and as the Justice Department has pointed out in the litigation in front of Deary, this special master thing is not something anybody forced on Trump. This is a civil case that Trump brought, that he has the burden of proof on. So, he's now saying, I don't want to say anything because it might compromise my position if the Justice Department indicts me later on. And what the Justice Department is saying is, then don't file a lawsuit. Right. But he's filed one. So, and the other thing I guess that we should point out is it's costing him goo gobs of money. I mean, they have to get all these documents processed. There's been an issue about whether any of the contractors would be willing to work for Trump. So they went to 5 different people to try to get this stuff digitized, and they wouldn't do it. So now the Justice Department had to get involved to get somebody to agree to do it. And they had to get Trump to promise that he would pay the bill when they gave it to him. It's costing thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, and I think he's going to get nothing out of it but grief for himself.
So let's go to another story, very underappreciated. A sheikh whose name I'm not even going to attempt to say. I'll defer to you. Dead at 96, highly influential in Sunni Islam, spiritual leader, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas. Who is this character, Andy?
Yeah, this is Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is probably the most influential Sunni Islamic figure in the last at least half century. He, as you just mentioned, he was the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, also of Hamas, which is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in his role, when we say that someone's a spiritual leader in Islamic circles, it's really, I actually shouldn't use that term because it's a misnomer, because what he's a master of is not spiritualism per se. It's the doctrine of Sharia, which is Islam's not only legal code, but societal framework. So it's not really spiritualism, because Islam doesn't really distinguish between how you're supposed to conduct yourself in the here and the hereafter. I think, Rich, probably his most important contribution, and there are many that he made to this doctrine of aggressive Sharia supremacism, is that he took it global in a way that others hadn't before, by having an internationally broadcast program that's called Sharia and Life, which has millions of people who follow it. I mean, he really broke the mold in terms of showing how you could get the message and the teaching out. He famously said, "We will conquer America and we will conquer Europe, but not through jihad, through dawah." And what dawah loosely means is proselytism in the conventional sense. But what he meant by it was something more aggressive than that I don't even think we have a word for. And it really doesn't work without jihad, because the idea is there has to be an atmosphere of intimidation, and that's caused by jihad, and then that makes the political and other elites in a society more open to being accommodating to what Islamic leaders want. The strategy as he implemented it has been described as voluntary apartheid. And I think the places where you see it best are in Europe, the no-go zones in Europe. His idea was he wanted Muslims to emigrate out of the Islamic countries to Europe and the United States, throughout the West. And the idea was they were to establish beachhead neighborhoods in each place and then proliferate them and try to knit them together. And at the same time, put pressure on the host government to allow the Muslim communities to govern themselves under their own law rather than the law of the host nation. And it was incredibly successful in Europe. It was really transformative in many ways in Europe. It hasn't been as successful in the United States, but it's probably done a lot more to spread not only jihadism but this very aggressive form of Sharia than anything any of the jihadists did, such as al-Qaeda. He had kind of a testy relationship with al-Qaeda. He acknowledged that what they believed in were the same things and their goals were the same goals, but he was a much more pragmatic actor than bin Laden. So, for example, Qaradawi condemned the 9/11 attacks, but not because they were wrong in principle. He condemned them on a cost-benefit analysis that the blowback that Muslims were going to receive by basically waking up the sleeping giant was so much worse than whatever they were going to achieve by the 9/11 attacks themselves, that they weren't worth it. It was nothing, people in the West who fawned over Qaradawi, especially these folks at Georgetown, who have a whole center that that tried to cast him as a moderate. They like to highlight the fact that he condemned the 9/11 attacks and what they would say is because they killed civilians. Actually, where Qaradawi was coming from was exactly the same place that bin Laden was coming from on the matter of killing civilians. Basically, what bin Laden said was civilians in countries that are hostile to Islam are fair game because they can all take up arms. He didn't consider them to be civilians. His problem with the 9/11 attacks was strictly that it was on a cost-benefit idea. It was a bad outcome for Muslims. By contrast, he not only he very enthusiastically encouraged the jihad against American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan on the theory that these were Western invaders on Muslim territory, and they had to be driven out, and that it was the obligation of all Muslims to do that. So in any event, he was a highly, highly influential figure. And there was a moment in time when, during the Arab Spring, when the Muslim Brotherhood took over the Egyptian government, when it looked like Qaradawi might, become a Khomeini type figure and actually take over in Egypt. But even in that, I think he was more forward-thinking than a lot of the people he was dealing with. He thought he was doing more by the media broadcasting than he would have been by, taking over a very troubled country in Egypt. So very dastardly figure, but a interesting and influential one.
And then, Andy, final thing, really briefly, there was a scheduled January 6th committee hearing that was canceled at the last minute. What's going on there?
Rich, I think, the ostensibly they say, well, they had the big hurricane in Florida and, Washington needed to keep its eye on that. And they didn't want it to detract from their work. There's a lot of reporting that they don't really know how to wrap it up at this point. They know they have to do a report, and that's probably the most important thing. We've discussed this before. Everybody on that committee, Republican or Democrat, is unified in anti-Trump animus. But once you get away from anti-Trump animus, they're not unified, and they're not in the same place on what is to be done about it. So apparently, Liz Cheney wants to have additional hearings, and she's still, I think, committed to trying to make the case that Trump's guilty of a felony in connection with the Capitol riot, at least the obstruction of the congressional vote, and she wants to continue to pursue that. Of course, her time is running out, so this is more her congressional legacy. The Democrats who are going to continue on after this is all over, they're kind of in a place where, look, we had these hearings in the summer. Our work is pretty much done. We're going to get this report out. They're saying they may have one more hearing. That was what was supposed to be yesterday. They're not even in agreement on what the hearing should be about. And the problem I think they have now, which they didn't have during the summer, is they're really competing with these other investigations of Trump for attention. So, maybe they'll have a hearing next week. Maybe they won't. But I think they're in a little bit of disarray. And it was probably inevitable because we're getting to the part where they have to propose, positive changes in the law and other things that they may not be in as tight agreement on as the anti-Trump animus.
So that's all the time we have. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Andy McCarthy.
Thanks, Rich.